Today's menu is a classic beef stew from Isekai Shokudo, also known as Restaurant to Another World. To begin today's recipe, we're going to prep some veg. Firstly, we're going to peel 500 grams each of carrots and potatoes. Then we're also going to peel 1 to 2 extra carrots and 1 more potato. Set them off to one side and we'll get back to them later. Once your veg is all peeled, we're going to simply cut them all into even sized 2cm chunks. You can elect to do this by cutting the carrots into rounds, or in my case, I'm going to be using an irregular roll and cut, similar to how you prepare Japanese curry, just to give more variety of shapes in the stew. I plan to do this for the potatoes as well, but then I got a bit lazy, so feel free to cut your veg however you like. Next up, we're going to peel 2 brown onions before cutting them into a rough dice. You don't want these guys to be too small since you're going to be cooking this for a few hours, so somewhere around 1 to 1.5cm dice works really well here. Lastly, for our normal veg prep, we're also going to be smashing and peeling 5 cloves of garlic. Once that's all done, we can set them off to one side in a bowl until we're ready to use them. Now let's talk about the meat for our stew. Ideally, you should be using something like chuck steak, which has a good amount of fat that is marbled throughout the meat. Unfortunately, my local butcher didn't have any chuck on hand, so the meat that I'm using today is going to be quite lean. Now off camera, I've just cut the beef up into 2.5cm cubes, and now we're just going to pat it all dry using some paper towel. Make sure that you're really getting in there when patting it dry, because removing the surface moisture of the beef is going to help us to get a better sear later on with less effort. Then once your beef is nice and dry, we're going to very generously season it with salt and freshly ground black pepper. Give everything a thorough mixing to ensure that the seasoning is covering all of the meat evenly, and then we can head over to the stove. Turn your stove onto a high heat and begin heating a large oven-safe saucepan or Dutch oven. To our cooking vessel of choice, we're going to be adding in 1 tablespoon worth of vegetable oil and allowing that to heat up until it's hot and shimmering. When the oil is up to temp, we can begin searing the beef. Add in about 1/3 of the meat so that the pan doesn't get overcrowded, otherwise you'll end up steaming the beef rather than searing it. Let the beef hang out for about a minute or so, and if it has a nice bit of colour on it like this, it's ready to flip. After the beef has had about 5 minutes worth of searing time, we can remove the beef from the pan and transfer it over to a plate. Now we're just going to repeat this process of adding in a batch of beef, searing it on all sides and transferring it to a plate 2 more times, adding more oil between each batch as necessary. Once all the beef has been seared and removed from the pan, we're turning the heat down to medium-high and adding in all of our chopped up onions and peeled garlic cloves. Then to our aromatics, I'm also going to be adding in 1 tablespoon or 15 ml of Worcestershire sauce because I thought it was balsamic vinegar, and then after smelling it and realizing I added in the wrong ingredient, I'm actually going to add in 2 tablespoons or 30 ml of balsamic vinegar. Give everything in the pot a stir so that everything can start to mingle, and let the onions cook for about 5 minutes, stirring occasionally until they're slightly softened. When the onions are starting to soften, we can stir in 1 tablespoon of tomato paste and allow that to cook off for 1 minute, and it becomes lovely and aromatic. Deglaze the pan with 1 cup of red wine, ensuring to scrape up all of that beautiful fond that has formed on the bottom of the pan from frying off the beef and the onions, and then back to the saucepan we're going to be adding in all of our beef along with any of the juices that have been released. Throw in a 1/4 cup of all-purpose flour into the pan and stir everything together and allow that to cook off for about 2 minutes or until the smell of raw flour disappears. During that time, you should also see that the liquid in the pan becomes very thick and gravy-like in texture. Once your meat looks like this, we're sprinkling over 1 teaspoon worth of dried thyme, throwing in a couple of bay leaves and pouring in 1 cup or 250 ml of water and 4 cups or 1 litre of beef stock. At this point, you'd also add in the Worcestershire sauce if you're on a dummy like me and actually read your recipe through correctly. Give the contents of the pot a good stir to distribute all the herbs, and then we're going to cover this with a lid and bring this to a boil over a high heat. When you can see that the stew has come up to a boil, we're going to turn off the heat, keep the stew covered with a lid and transfer it into an oven that's been preheated to 160 degrees Celsius fan forced and allow this to braise for 2 hours. Hey guys, this next segment is all about turning and cutting vegetables so that we can plate up the beef stew like how it was shown in the anime. It does go on for a little bit, so feel free to skip to this timestamp if you aren't ever going to bother with turning vegetables. Just wanted to give you guys a heads up, and now back to the video. In the show, Master plates up the beef stew with a pool of sauce on the plate and then neatly lines up 4 pieces of the meat and garnishes the plate with a broccoli floret, turned carrots and a turned potato. While this seems really unnecessary, we're still going to follow the presentation of the anime. So, turning a vegetable is a traditional technique in which you carve vegetables into equally sized shapes. This is to ensure your vegetables all cook at the same rate and was also used for visual appeal. I'll just go ahead and say right now that I'm actually quite bad at turning vegetables since I've only done it like once or twice in my life, but the idea is pretty simple. Firstly, you want to cut your vegetables into even sized lengths. For the carrots, I cut them into 5cm pieces. Then using a turning knife, what you should do is start from the top of the vegetable and pull your turning knife in an arcing motion all the way to the base. After you've done that, you want to rotate the vegetable in your hand and move your knife back to the top before repeating the arcing and cutting motion down to the base of the vegetable again. In total, you want to do this about 5 to 7 times based on your desired presentation. Because I'm well out of practice, I was turning the carrot from the center and doing each side separately. I really don't recommend doing this as it can make the vegetables look quite irregular on the surface, which is the exact opposite of what turning is about. I've linked a video in the description that demonstrates the turning technique in great detail. You may have also noticed that I ended up carving away a fair bit of the carrot each time I passed over it with a turning knife, and while it's true that turning does produce some waste, it shouldn't produce as much as I'm making here, and this is absolutely a representation of my lack of experience with the technique rather than the technique itself. But the good thing is you can just freeze all of these scraps and use them later for a soup, stock or a puree. Then for the potato, it's a much easier process. It looks like Master just trimmed away parts of the potato to make it look a bit more angular. Luckily, the potato that I reserved is fairly ball shaped already, so we're just going to go around the entire potato, shaving off little pieces to give it a more angular look, and by the end of this whole process, your turned vegetables should look something like this. At this point, you can set them off to one side until the stew is nearly ready.
2 hours later.
Speaking of the stew, after 2 hours have passed, I've removed it from the oven as it's now ready for the vegetables to go in. Carefully pour in all of your cut carrots and potato that were prepared earlier and give everything a good stir to distribute the veggies. Cover the stew with the lid and then place it back into the oven for one final hour of braising or until the vegetables are nice and tender. When the stew is nearly ready to come out of the oven, we can begin steaming our veg for the anime accurate plating. The potato is going to take the longest to cook due to its size, so we're going to start by placing that into our steam basket and allowing that to steam on its own for 18 minutes. After that, we're going to add in the turned carrots and allow them to steam with the potato for an additional 6 minutes. When those 6 minutes are up, we can add in the broccoli florets and allow everything to steam for a final 6 minutes. Then as a personal touch, I wanted to add a bit more flavour to the steamed veggies, so when the vegetables are only a couple minutes away from being completely steamed, we're going to heat a small frying pan over a medium flame and add in a small amount of butter and let that melt down until it begins to brown. When the butter is brown, the vegetables should be cooked and we can transfer the carrots and broccoli florets into the frying pan. Just make sure that you pat them down before putting them into the pan like I did, otherwise butter is going to start spitting everywhere. Then we just want to give the carrots and broccoli a quick toss in the butter and season them with some salt and pepper. We're not really looking to add any colour to them so that we can stay fairly accurate to the anime, but I wanted to at least add a little bit of extra flavour into the veggies for the garnish. I'm also going to transfer the potato into a ramekin with a pat of salted butter and just let that slowly melt into the potato off camera. Once they're nicely coated in the butter and seasoning, turn off the heat and keep these guys warm until you're ready to plate up. By this point the stew should have finished cooking, so we're going to pull it out of the oven and check that the veggies are cooked. You'll know that they're done when you can insert a sharp knife into the veg and it glides in without any resistance. Once you're happy that the veggies are cooked, we're just about ready to serve up, but if you can manage to, try and fish out the bay leaves first before you serve up. I managed to find one, but after a bit more digging around, I just kinda gave up because I was starting to get really hangry. To plate our Isekai Shokudo beef stew, we'll begin by pulling a generous amount of sauce into the center of our plate. Then onto one side of the plate, we're going to neatly arrange 4 pieces of our beef and ignore the fact that one of the corners flaked off and is just kind of hanging out on the plate there. Didn't notice that when I was filming, but man, it's really bugging me now that I'm editing. Next up, we're going to place a potato behind the beef and let it just spin into place, I guess. Don't worry about it, it'll sort itself out. Finally, we're adding one of our buttered broccoli florets and both of the buttered turned carrots, and here you have the most impractical version of beef stew from Isekai Shokudo. As I mentioned near the start of this episode, if you want to make beef stew, try and get beef that has a decent amount of fat that's marbled through it. You can see here that the beef that I used still ended up being very tender and breaks apart easily with just a fork, but because it was so lean, it ended up being a little bit dry. Thankfully, this dish is quite saucy, so that helps to balance out the leanness of the meat. With all that being said, let's get into the tasting. Ignoring the really unnecessary plating style used in the anime, this dish turned out really well. While the beef is a little bit dry due to being lean, it still provides a great beefy flavour, and after being braised for 3 hours in that sauce, it has also become very tender. The carrots and broccoli have kept their natural flavours due to being steamed, and being tossed in that brown butter has also given them a toasty nuttiness as well. As for the buttered potato, it's a buttery ball of carbs, so you already know that it tastes good, if a little bit boring. Finally, you've got that luscious beef stew sauce, and honestly, since I use lean meat, this is the star of the show. The sauce has a wonderful richness and mouthfeel, it's beefy without being overpowering, and the flavours of the herbs and the red wine also come through really well. All in all, this is a fantastic and hearty dish that just warms your soul. My only advice with this recipe, besides using a fattier cut of meat, is to just serve it in a bowl like a normal person. This way you can get all those veggies that have just soaked up all of that incredible sauce instead of these steamed veggies that just seem like more of an afterthought in comparison. As always my friends, thanks so much for watching today's episode. If you enjoyed it, let me know by dropping a like down below, and let me know in the comments what food from anime and other media you'd like to see in the future. Subscribe to the channel for a new episode every single week, and until then, pull up a chair, unfurl that napkin, and I'll see you in the anime kitchen. Cheers.